My name is Andy Gilman, and I'm the director of the Agora Foundation. Welcome to our 15th, if you can believe it, Ojai Chautauqua panel. The event is being recorded. It'll be on our website, and it's live streaming right now on Facebook, if you can believe that. And we have about 1 million people. No, I'm just kidding. I have no idea how many people. I wish it was 1 million. The purpose of the Ojai Chautauqua is to engage in civil discourse about complicated subjects, especially subjects where there's a lot of emotion and it's hard to get good information, like on Facebook. So we try to put panels together that represent many points of view, and we supply that also with data that we can collect to at least ground the conversation. And there's a chance for you to ask your own questions. So on your chair, you should have a note card and a pen. And in the course of the conversation, some questions might occur to you. And if they do, please write your question down on the card, include your name, and if you are directing your question towards someone particular, please note that, or if it's to all the panelists. And please write legibly so that I can read it up here. That would be great. So about halfway through, I'll announce it, and we'll have people come down and get those questions from you. Every Ojai Chautauqua subject that we've explored, it's complicated, and we can't cover the entire subject in 2 hours. So we won't be able to get to everything about wildland fire prevention and what to do with your own home and those kinds of things in this one panel. But we'll have more panels. So similarly with water, we'll cover several subjects over time. And in this panel today, we want to focus on 2 general areas. One is, what are the options for reducing frequency, severity, and effects of wildland fire? That's the first area. And the second area is, individually, what can each of us do to reduce the effects? I want to highlight the materials that are on your seat. This packet contains data about temperature over time, precipitation, some short history of wildland fire, and also some differing opinions about wildland management that we'll get into. And this document, there isn't one on every single chair, but John actually brought a whole box in there in the back so everyone can leave with this document, which has very detailed information about what you can do in your home, keeping it clear, different kinds of things. So I encourage everybody to leave with one of these, and they're in an envelope like this at a box in the back table. Before I bring out the panel, I want to mention 2 things. The first is, if you want to receive our communications and you aren't, there's an email list outside on the table. Please write your email down if you do want to receive our communications, and please write your email legibly so I can put it in the computer correctly. And the second is, I want to highlight this back page of this document. These are our contributing members. These are foundations, individuals, organizations that make these events possible. So if you find this to be a valuable experience and you want to keep them going, I ask you to go to the website and make a donation to become part of this group. Today's event is free because of a donation from individual donors in this very room, foundations, and the Ojai Valley Chamber of Commerce support. So we're all in this together, and if you like what you're hearing today, please be a part of it. So finally, let me say a few words about our panelists before I bring them out. Sean Anderson is a professor of environmental science and resource management at Channel Islands University. Bryant Baker is conservation director for Los Padres Forest Watch. Theresa Bulla-Richards is a research scientist, educator, community leader, and environmental activist. And Will Castagna is founder of the Ojai Valley Fire Safe Council and currently serves as its board president. Please welcome our panel. Oh, I forgot John, well, maybe the most important guy, John McNeil, our local assistant fire chief for Ventura County. We can't forget John and thank John enough. Thank you, Sean. As Sean's getting water for everybody, let me start off with our first question. And I think it's a basic question, but maybe something worth considering. Are periodic wildland fires inevitable in our region? Does anybody want to tackle that?
Yes.
Are they inevitable?
Yes, they are.
And why is that? Say more.
So fire is a natural part of our ecosystems here. It depends on where our specific houses are or the area, but fire is a natural part of things. So we've seen that going back through all the vegetative records and geological records that fire does happen. So it's a part of our lives.
Does anybody disagree with that? Okay. Let me go on to something else. Given that, are frequencies and severities getting worse, and if so, why? So, Sean, maybe I can start with you there again.
Yes, again. We have had big fires historically, but compared to the last several decades, when we created the U.S. Forest Service, we began a nationwide approach of fire suppression. And the idea there was we viewed our environment from a utilitarian lens, that the value of that forest or the value of that wood or trees or shrubs or whatever it was would be what you and I could convert it into sticks to build our houses, our chairs, what have you. And so fire was somehow robbing us of that. So this notion was, let's suppress fire so that we could have all of those materials for our own needs. And that, unfortunately, took us down a crazy path. And so we were very good at figuring out how to knock down fires across the U.S., but particularly in the western U.S. And so we've inherited that. So one of the things we've inherited are huge fuel loads, so huge amounts of materials that are potentially burnable. And so that sort of started the stage. And then we've been doing more things like encroaching in on these areas where we didn't used to live. And so there's more of us in proximity to more of this potential fuel. So our development patterns, our growth patterns have been part of that. Of course, climate change is part of this. In this context, most manifests in terms of things like insect outbreaks and the like in the western forests that have caused die-offs through promotion of things like bark beetles, but then also just in general more winds, more stronger winds, or Santa Anas are becoming more frequent and more intense. Then, of course, droughts, so the overall lack of humidity and lack of moisture. So, for example, during our most recent fire, the Woolsey fire, we've found extensive areas in the Santa Monica Mountains where it's completely devoid of anything. It's just rocks left after. And that's highly unusual. A typical, quote-unquote, typical fire from a decade or two or three ago would have burnt everything, but there would have been some stumpy branches and shrubs and things, skeletons at least, left around. In many places there's nothing, and that's because the vegetation is so dry. It was basically almost kiln dried before the wildfire flames touched that object. And so that dryness, those winds, all that stuff comes together to make it much easier to have these, what would have otherwise been a relatively small fire, become a huge conflagration. Now, we've had those in the past, but it's becoming more the norm to see that.
Mm-hmm. Is that your experience, John? That severity and frequency is increasing? Yeah,
absolutely. And Sean explained it well. It's the fuel that burns, obviously. I think we all get that. But the fuel load has changed. The fuel dynamics or characteristics has changed based on what Sean said about the drought and global warming and all the potential influences. The other point to consider is these wildfires, 85% of them start from a man-made cause or a human-made cause. So as long as the population's going up and the fuel load continues on the course it is, they're going to become more severe and more often, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to remember and talk about the difference between different types of ecosystems, right? Mm-hmm. So in our region, the relevant ecosystem that we want to talk about is chaparral, coastal sage scrub, shrubland ecosystems. And in these, the shrublands here, the normal fire regime is large, infrequent, high intensity, high severity fire. Most of that above ground vegetation burns off. You should have, leftover stems and things like that. Now, when we talk about forest, I do think we have a tendency to put this sort of blanket discussion about forests and how they've changed over the last maybe century. And we got to remember that even in the western United States, we have very different forests in, say, Arizona or Southern California and some of the high elevation areas compared to forests that we have up in Oregon or Washington or even Montana, the Northern Rockies. So I think it's important to make those distinctions. Mm-hmm. And I think what's even maybe more important is that we talk about what are we talking about in terms of severity or maybe when we say catastrophic fire. Are we talking about how that fire affects that ecosystem or how that fire affects communities? Oh, yes, sorry. Thank you. That was my girlfriend who told me to do that. That's why she came here. Thank you. So I'm going to explain all of that again. No. But I think it's important that we talk about how fires affect communities, how that's changing, and how fires affect ecosystems, and how that's maybe changing as well. And I think we'll get into that discussion more. But it is really important in Chaparral, in our relevant ecosystem in our region. We've got to remember that this ecosystem naturally is accustomed to large, intense, severe fires, right? And what has drastically changed is the frequency of ignitions. And when you have ignitions under extreme weather conditions, extreme winds, you can have a large fire. And that has been the case even before European settlement for a long time.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add really quick. So in the Santa Monica Mountains, where my university is and my home is, we've actually seen that it is not suffering like the rest of the country with all these fuel loads. Actually, we've had so many ignition sources. The what's called the fire return rate, how frequently a fire comes in here, has been shrinking every year, and it's 99% of that is people, right? So people. Like high school kids going out drinking, starting a fire at night, or a car, pulling off the side of the road, and it's incredible how quickly this fire is continuing to return to these landscapes.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
So one point I want to add is, I think the next page talks about the largest California fires, and we're going to reference some data throughout this discussion, and there's largest, there's most deadly, and the one that I think could be the most pertinent to this discussion is the most destructive. And the CAL FIRE report on that is, of the most destructive 20 fires, 9 of those have happened since 2015. So almost half in the most recent time are the most destructive. And destructive comes from the amount of structure loss.
And if I could add to that, I think it's odd. I think John raises a good point about talking about largest versus destructive, because if you look on page 5, you've got the California's 23 largest wildfires, and there actually is a slight mistake on there. The Rush Fire that only resulted in one structure loss, and it was a little bit larger. So when you look at this, only 5 of those fires are in the top 23 most destructive fires. So large, don't just assume that a large fire is necessarily going to be a destructive fire. We have large fires occurring out in the backcountry areas away from homes. They're not destroying homes. And so I think that's really important to remember. And I always say this, there's how we address this problem, I think, is a little bit different. How we address ecosystems burning, and whether we want to address that, because again, a lot of our ecosystems in California, including Chaparral, are fire adapted, and they need fire at some particular type of fire regime. And then how are communities burning, and why are communities burning? How we address those, I think, are different, and that's a really important distinction to make as we talk.
This is a good segue, actually, to the next question. There are many past and proposed methods for wildland fire severity control, and there are differing opinions about their effectiveness. So actually, Bryant, let me start with you. From your perspective, what works in reducing that fire severity? How do we manage a woodland area? What works and what doesn't from your perspective?
Did you say me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think in the past, what our focus has been...
Or maybe you can describe some, because maybe everybody doesn't know, just some of the different methods of...
Sure.
Yeah, what that is.
I think this actually has a pretty good list. But let's just talk about Chaparral for now, because I think that we can get in a really deep conversation about logging and thinning and forest. But I want to keep it in this local context, because I think that's really important for the people in this room. So in Chaparral, I think the main focus historically has been to focus on vegetation, and typically a little bit further away from communities. And I think what we have done mostly is create fuel breaks. And there's a lot of issues with that I can go into later. And then there's this other method, controlled burning, prescribed fire, and that has a lot of issues as well. From there, I think you get away from vegetation. You start focusing on the human element of all this, early detection systems. I don't know that we have done as much as we should have with early detection, evacuation, things like that. And I think where we definitely lack, substantive action has been on making sure that homes are fire safe, fire adapted, right? We want to make sure that homes have the highest probability of surviving if they start getting attacked with embers during a wildfire. But I'll just say, when we talk about prescribed fire, particularly in chaparral, there is a lot of science on this. There have been a lot of studies that have been published over the last couple of decades about prescribed fire specifically. And Sean kind of mentioned this. We have this overly frequent fire problem in chaparral ecosystems, particularly in Southern California. We have too many fires happening at too short of intervals. So let's say we take a place, let's say it's out in the mountains over here. If that area burns, what happens and what needs to happen after that burn is you need to have enough time for these native shrub species to grow to maturity and start producing enough seed to replenish the seed bank. Mm-hmm. That's one. Two, you have to have enough time for the species that are able to resprout after fire. They've got to be able to put enough carbon storage back into their root systems so that they're able to resprout after the next fire. Okay, that's two. Three, you have to have enough vegetation buildup, and this is where everybody freaks out a little bit, but you have to have enough vegetation buildup to create a hot enough fire the next time so that it actually stimulates seed germination after that fire. A lot of seeds, a lot of obligate seeding plants in the chaparral, they have to have a particular temperature that they reach before they're even going to germinate. So what we see with prescribed fire is that if you are adding fire at too short of intervals, those things don't happen. So our native plants, they don't come back. And what gets replaced is a mixture of non-native grasses and weeds, which actually dry out earlier in the year. They become ignition zones, and they can spread wildfire more quickly. So that's a really key thing to remember, particularly about prescribed fire.
Yeah, so I would say, so we've done some experiments, we've done monitoring to follow up some experiments that were done in the 1950s, where people were specifically worried about managing vegetation. And so the thought back then was all these shrubs are really dangerous. And so on a part of the UCLA campus that is now dorms, up until a few years ago we could monitor it, but some experiments were done where it was coastal sage scrub and chaparral was cleared, and then folks actively planted different types of, seeded with different types of plants that they wanted to see. And the long story short, all the ones that were cleared had much greater fuel loads than the ones that were an intact, healthy ecosystem. And so sometimes our vegetation management, taken very well-meaning, actually causes the reverse. And particularly, we're talking about non-native invasive grasses from Europe and Asia. As far as the controlled burns go, which is one of the tools, I would love to be able to use controlled burns. I would suggest that we do not use controlled burns here. So I went to my 19th controlled burn before I ever saw a controlled burn. All of the previous were called off, usually the day before or a day or so before, because of concerns over air quality. Various concerns, but mostly over air quality. So the idea there was people were worried, hey, if we set off this fire, it's going to cause a bunch of smoke, and then if people are sensitive asthma or whatever the issue is, that would be bad for them. And so these excellent health codes we have and well-meaning policies are beginning to run into each other with a lot of these things that we need to do to keep ourselves safe and resilient in this world we're moving into. And so yes, I don't want to make it bad for someone to breathe, but the fact that we maybe are prevented from using some of these tools means that it's more likely that we have these wildfires that are much harder to control, that screw up the air quality, for example, for much longer periods of time. Also, a lot of our controlled burns are complicated by lawsuits. So when we do a controlled burn, as John and other folks could comment, there's a lot of work that goes in setting up fire breaks, clearing things so that we only burn area X or the location. But every once in a while, something happens, right? And we don't want that to happen, and there's fire crews stationed around these controlled burns, but sometimes things get away. That has made a lot of our public agencies very risk averse to using this because they say, oh, if this thing gets out of control, it doesn't mean that we don't do control burns, but all these things come together to make these tools more difficult to use. And I would like to see, and some of our communities need more frequent fire, others don't. But if we don't have all these tools, it becomes difficult to know when to use them. For example, now most of our control burns are pushed towards the fall and winter, because it's less likely that if we did have a fire, it would burn for a long period of time. Whereas, the fire in that area maybe naturally happen more in the summertime or something like that. So having tools that are really in our quiver that we can use to address these things are really, really important, whatever those particular tools may be.
Yeah, and Sean's right on with that. The technical term is called prescribed burn, and there's a prescription written for the intent of it, the acreage, the location, and then within that prescription, there's certain weather parameters it's got to be within. There's air quality standards it's got to hit. So it does become very challenging to keep it within the prescription. And you're absolutely right. If we do it in the springtime, the fuel's too wet, produces too much smoke. We're out of the prescription for the air pollution control district. In the fall, we battle fire weather, winds, and low humidities, which is great for getting a clean burn if that's part of the intent. But we run the risk of getting it outside the control boundaries. So it is a huge challenge. There's an environmental impact to all of this, and I think Bryant explained that well. So vegetation management through controlled burning is one of them that the fire department is pursuing. We have full-time staff that's constantly looking at key areas within the county around this valley that we can start writing these prescriptions for. But there's quite a few hoops to jump through, and there's a fair amount of work, and at times it could take 8 years to write a prescription for a 100-acre control burn. So that's not really efficient. But one thing I do want to say about that, because
That's true.
I don't think it's efficient. One thing I want to say about that, though, there is progression there, and it is encouraging. And at the state level, they've relaxed some of the standards. And one thing that's being pushed right now is the ranchers that own 10 acres or more, that they use it for grazeland, are now, it's relaxed enough to where they can do their own control burn. Now, there's some influence from the fire department. We'll come out and we'll help them write the prescription, but they actually light the fire. They take responsibility for it. It's all within reason. It sounds kind of crazy, but what it is doing is it does create an opportunity to get more of these control burns. And I believe there'll be some environmental influence on this and some other folks that have to weigh in on it. But ultimately, it comes down to the rancher. If he wants to or she wants to burn on their property and it makes sense. And there's a great article that was written by a family that ranches in the hills above Santa Paula, and it goes back a couple generations, but I can't even think of the reference right now. Maybe I'll get it to Andy and we can post it. But it speaks to that, and it's the current owner's grandfather when he used to burn, and now he's the grandson and he wants to burn his own property in today's time, and he keeps referencing that and wondering why he can't do it. And I think he's going to be able to do it here pretty soon. But just one more point I want to add on this big picture about methods to reduce severities and what the fire department's doing. And the way we look at this is from the prevention side and the response side. So on the prevention side, we're trying to build buffer zones between the houses and the wildlands. So the first part on the outside of that, if you look at it as a circle around the house, is the vegetation management, and it's already been spoken to. The second part of that, or closer to the house, is that 100-foot clearance that the county fire department requires on all structures within that hit certain criteria. That's been in place for 30 years now, and that 100-foot clearance does two things. One, it makes the house a bit more resilient from your typical fire. The Thomas fire is not your typical fire. But I would say 95+% of our fires, that house should be able to stand alone if that weed abatement or that hazard reduction zone, that 100-foot zone, is properly maintained. The third part of this exercise or this effort is hardening the homes, and I think we'll discuss that a little more in detail, but that 100-foot clearance didn't do much on the Thomas fire when it's sending embers, right, 3/4 of a mile out in front of it. So what you need to do, now you got to consider your house as a receptive fuel bed, right? So how do we harden that to keep that ember that just traveled 3/4 of a mile from igniting the house? So we consider, building codes and fire codes that are going to prevent that ember from causing the house to burn. So that's where the fire department's going with the efforts on the prevention side. And then just on the response side,
Good.
that 100-foot clearance, when you're on a fire truck and you drive up a cul-de-sac or you drive up any of the roads we have here in the Ojai Valley, and you see a house or a neighborhood that has properly done their weed abatement, that gives that safety zone, that buffer zone for those fire crews to get in there and actually do some productive work. They are going to always do a risk versus gain assessment, and when they pull in and they see proper weed abatement, they'll engage it. If it's not, it's going to take a while to talk themselves into going in there if they go in there at all. So that's the second part of the weed abatement.
I have two questions.
Can I just comment on that?
Go ahead, please.
So that's great, and this is, and Ventura County was one of the places that buffer, that clearance buffer came from, that's now across the state. I think some more recent information, though, is showing that it doesn't necessarily have to be 100 feet. So I think 100 feet was, we got to pick some number, right? 10 is too close.
It's easy math.
Right. So there's some natural reasons for that. But maybe more like 84 feet or 80 feet, somewhere in that range, might actually be just as effective. One of the problems is, particularly in our areas where we have conservation concern, by clearing additional areas around things, park outhouses and all these various things, and as our houses encroach more into the wildlands urban interface, then we have to clear more, that oftentimes what we see in this cleared area is the promotion of these non-native weedy grasses that actually are fuel, right? So if we could have the same level of protection for the home or the structure, but have a little teeny bit, you might think, 20 feet or 16 feet, does it really matter? Yes, when you think of all of Ojai or all of Ventura County, that is up to a large amount of acreage. So I think it's also worth looking critically at these numbers. The idea is a solid idea, but maybe it should be a little teeny bit smaller.
So a huge part of making a fire break is maintaining it. Right, so some of the fire breaks that we have here that weren't maintained, not recently, but in the past that we used to hike, they were filled with non-native plants that grow into that space. John, can I ask you though, on page 10 of the packet here, this is a map of Los Padres, and I wanted to ask you that this is a proposal. Is that right? Not from you, but from the Forest Department.
That's correct. It's from the forest.
Yes.
So there's
Good.
When you look at jurisdiction of lands, there's local lands, there's state lands, and there's federal lands, and this is all federal land-based.
So this would be, it's a 2,000-foot wide break proposal?
Well, this is large. Well, are you talking about the yellow boundary? Because just on the purple, you're seeing a lot of fuel breaks that were done years ago. That
Right.
was actually from 2007.
So this is an old one?
Well, it is an old map, yes.
Okay.
So the only fuel breaks the fire department actually maintains is the Sulphur Mountain fuel breaks. When you look at this map, there is a little bit of work that's done out toward on the western edge of Lake Casitas, up on Laguna Ridge.
Okay.
But overall, in the whole county, there's almost 140 miles of maintained fuel breaks. But around the Ojai Valley, it's pretty limited.
Got it.
And can I just say
Please.
about fuel breaks? You said something about maintenance and that they were full of non-native plants. I'll just say that the whole idea of a fuel break is to change the fuel type. So you're changing it from chaparral or coastal sage shrubs to grasses, and generally those grasses are non-native. So I don't know that there is such thing as maintaining fuel breaks without there being those non-native plants.
Got it.
And it's one of the concerns. It's a trade-off. You've got to look at how effective are these fuel breaks, and what are the ecological impacts and the cost of those. And one thing that we see with fuel breaks is that they become conduits for invasive plant spread into backcountry areas, which is why when you look at fuel break science, it generally, especially over the last couple of decades, has been recommending more and more, fuel breaks need to be closer and closer to communities. That's where they tend to be more effective. There was a study back in 2011 that looked at fuel breaks just in the Los Padres, and it found the effectiveness in terms of whether or not that fuel break actually helped stop the fire. It was about 46% of the time. But that was only when firefighters are present. So, and I'm sure John can talk about this more, but you have to remember that the fuel break is only going to be effective if firefighters are there to do certain activities, right? So with a fire like the Thomas fire, moving very high rate of spread, high rate of speed, you're not going to see a lot of firefighter activity out in front of that fire. And so we have to be thinking, this is something that I've been talking about a lot. As we start to experience more and more extreme weather conditions and fires occurring under these extreme weather conditions, we have to look at what are the techniques, what are the solutions that are going to work for those future events, rather than working for maybe what we've been used to in the past. And I think that's really important.
But I have to bring up, please,
yeah,
go ahead.
What I would add to that is
Closer.
Does my sound okay? Closer. What I would add to that is after the rim fire, some of the species that didn't burn were in mulch basins from gray water. And those same plants that were being watered by potable water burned. So I think when you have a fuel break, what you're affecting besides the species that grow there is the actual biology of the soil. And soil that is moist and soil that is healthy, plants have a better survival rate and fire doesn't spread at the rate it does. And one of the reasons this is of such concern for me in the residential life is that I know that the forest burned our home, but I also know our home burned the forest. And if you look at the areas next to houses that burned, the damage to the trees, the damage to the vegetation is really clear. And so if we as homeowners could, besides building with different materials, besides building more intelligently, if we could be looking at native plants, if we could be looking at gray water and stormwater retention and ways to keep the soil healthier, I think that is an important element.
That's really good. I want to bring up, you brought up this story to me, grazing as a method of severity reduction. So you were saying get a bunch of goats out to a field. Yes, John.
Yeah, absolutely. We use the fire department actually. We budget the item, and we use goats. So goats are real effective for maintaining, right? And it's because they like the grass. They're not going to go mow down trees, but and the closest area we use them is actually off Cesar Road in the Upper Ojai, and we went through there with hand crews. I want to say it was just inside of 10 years ago, and mechanically, with chainsaws and hard labor, cleared an area with thought. It wasn't clear cutting; it was thinning of the chaparral and maintaining the grasses. So once that was done, I can't think of the acreage, but it's at the top of Cesar. It heads toward the west above those homes, and that was one success story in the Thomas Fire. When you look at the aerial and how the fire basically went around that area. But we bring goats back every year to maintain that buffer zone. It's not a clear cut. It's not a fuel break in a sense. It's just a buffer zone for those homes.
Got it.
And one thing that the goats are doing besides clearing the vegetation, they're also with their hooves making little indentations in the soil, which again become sort of like little mini swales that catch water, catch debris, and again bring back the biology of the soil.
Right. I'm going to stick with you. I wanted to ask, what did we learn from the Thomas Fire, or what were we surprised by, or how did that fire seem different?
Are you referencing me?
Yes,
okay.
I am.
Well, we had been in our home in the Upper Ojai for about 44 years before the fire hit that night of December 4th. And there was the initial experience that I had, which was when the Stuckel fire ignited, which is what we're calling the Thomas Fire. It was pushing away from us towards Ventura. And at that point, as we had every other time, in spite of the fact that I had friends calling me, telling me to get out, I was like, no, I'm staying, because when there's embers that come back towards the house, I want to be able to be here to put them out. But when Königstein caught on fire, there besides the extreme wind that was already going, there was something that happened between those two fires in terms of a wind event that was phenomenal. So to the point where the fire actually didn't push me, or not the fire, the wind, but sucked me towards it. And it was as if, I don't know if any of you have ever surfed at night, but when you're surfing at night, whether or not you take off on a wave is how much curve, sort of that circular pattern that a wave will form before it breaks, like a little swell, feels very different, and then it starts building. And that, when it lifted me, it curled me backwards like a wave getting ready to break. And then then I was back down on the ground, and then it was at that point when I went, yeah, I'm out of my league here. This is not the fire. But then post-fire, what was amazing to me was the degree to which our soil, and this is, old forest under oak trees, 2 parts of that soil had really become like a ceramic. They had burned, the heat was so intense that the soil was fired. And that's where, for me, this idea that the fire is a regenerative event, I think fires are, but firestorms, no. Because of the intensity of the heat. And that's where, again, I think whatever part of the land we're on, whatever we can do to keep the health of the soil going. A phenomenon in our fire was that we had areas of the land that just, you could tell they burned incredibly hot, and yet the area around our garden had not burned. And I'm talking, little pieces of wood that we had put up to keep the peacocks out of our garden. those did not burn. Whereas huge, massive 12 by 12s had burned right next door. So and again, that garden wasn't wet, we hadn't watered it, but the biology of the soil, Elaine Ingham, sort of the queen of soil, and all her practices we had put into that garden. And I believe that, as with the rim fire and those mulch basins, those plants not burning, I believe the reason we could walk in there and pick tomatoes and eat them 2 days after the fire was because of the soil. So again, correlation is not causality, but when you see this sort of repeated phenomenon, it's at least worth doing research on.
Right. And I want to ask you, John, what were you surprised by, I guess, by the fire, or what did you learn from it, or what do you think, what might happen differently if that were to happen again? Not what would you do differently, but what are you thinking? What's any strategy changes or anything like that?
Do we have 2 hours? 2 more hours? I was surprised that when I was there when it started, I was surprised I was still going to be there 21 days later. I mean, that really did surprise me because of the intensity of the weather.
Yeah.
And granted, this is December, right? That's not too unheard of, but it was just the duration of the intensity is what really surprised me.
Right.
Initially we had planned for it. I think we had all been talking about. We've been talking global warming. We've been talking about potential for catastrophic fires. At least in the fire service, we had been. That particular day, we had what we call upstaffing based on the forecast, and that particular day was about 60% additional staffing. And I'll tell you what, on the Thomas, what I learned that additional staffing and our normal staffing, they weren't putting a lot of water on the fire. They were putting people in fire trucks and driving them to safety because we didn't have enough time to properly message. We were challenged to message an evacuation. We were challenged with the infrastructure to message. When you rely on cell phone service, and those towers are wiped out in the first 5 minutes. We were relying on AM radio, where towers had gone down that serve the city of Ojai. We required electricity, all that stuff that we normally that we add into our plan. What it came down to was law enforcement officers driving around in their police cars and knocking on doors and using their bullhorn, and So that was one takeaway. We thought we could get away from that. We can now just push a button, everyone gets messages, they know when to leave, how to leave, and where to go. That wasn't the case because of the timing of it and the fact that it was just on us so quick. So, the real takeaway was, been doing this 30 plus years. 1985, this valley saw the Wheeler fire. That was my first fire. And, I thought that might be the career fire. And then I thought the Thomas might be the career fire. And then I was on the Woolsey fire. So it just speaks to what we've already talked about. But what it does, and why we're all here, is it makes us all rethink everything we're doing. Why are we living here in these environments? How do we adapt to them? How does a fire department provide prevention efforts? How do we respond to these? How do we evacuate people if that's what we're going to do? And the whole evacuation discussions become interesting. We can't clear this whole valley in whatever it took to get down here within an hour of the Thomas fire starting. We can't. So what are we doing moving forward? So we're going to have to rethink things and look at hybrid systems. When you research Australia, they've been dealing with this as long or longer than we have, especially on the evacuation piece. But all of those are my takeaways, and I can go on and on, but I'll let other people speak to it, and I'll be glad to speak to anyone afterwards. And I think we have some more topics coming up that might hit on some of that.
Any other comments about Thomas?
I would just say that one thing that I think we can take away from the Thomas fire is if you look at the fire history in the Thomas fire perimeter, you'll see a lot of fires going back at least to 1932, the Matilija fire, which was another massive fire, 220,000 acres. And a lot of those fires, so we've got the Matilija, we mentioned the 1985 Wheeler fire, there was the 1985 Ferndale fire, the Steckel fire in the 90s, the Creek Road fire, the Romero fire, the Coyote fire. I can keep going if you'd like. And there was a lot of overlap in those fires. And so if there's one thing that we can take away, I think it's that it goes back to that first question. Is fire inevitable in our region? Yeah, yes, unequivocally, yes. And we can either adapt to the region, the ecosystem, or we can try to make the ecosystem adapt to us. And I think that there's a lot we can learn in terms of how we can better adapt to the ecosystem, how we can create fire-adapted communities and fire-adapted homes. And I know we're going to get into that, but I think the Thomas Fire, and if you look at other fires since then, especially the Camp Fire up in Paradise, these fires, as catastrophic as they are and tragic as they are, they provide us, I think, examples and points, confluences, right, of the ways of thinking. And I think we can learn a lot from that. But again, I would just say the main takeaway is we need to learn how to adapt to the ecosystem and learn to live with fire in this system.
And I would just say real quick that we need to plan to be resilient, and we need to work towards that. And that's you guys coming to this event today, which is great. I mean, most recently we had the Woolsey Fire. I had 48 of my students were at the Borderline bar that was shot up, and then less than a few hours later, one fire starts that we thought was going to be a huge problem. It turned out that wasn't as much of a problem. Another small fire starts up. And so this notion of thinking of only wildfires also, I think, is incorrect. We have to think of this whole system that we are building more resilient communities. Wildfire, but one part of those. And I think to not think about that, to not plan for that, and that's as a society, and that's also individually how you're going to get through this stuff. There won't be enough money. There never is to rebuild your home exactly like you want. You don't have the same insurance, or the insurance coverage isn't enough. There's always these things. And I think it behooves us all to sort of go through that a little bit in our heads. And we were suffering, my students didn't have class for 4 weeks out of our 15-week semester because campus was evacuated or shut down or what have you. And they're real things, right? How do you keep your business going? How do you keep your classes going? And I think planning for that, not just in the infrastructure that we're talking about, and that's very, very important in the vegetation management and all that, but to figure how we might get ourselves through that is a really important exercise and can help get you in a better position, not if that happens, but when that happens next time. And so resilience for us, not just the ecosystem and the infrastructure, I think is important.
Yeah, as we transition to talk about that interface between where civilization is and the wildland, and how to what can we do, things like building materials, I do want to ask about increasing the resilience of let's say the utility infrastructure. And I know we had that conversation in the back, but any thoughts?
There's something wrong with utilities?
Well, we love. I want electricity. So I'm not saying living in harmony with nature means not having electricity, but what can be done or what's being discussed to improve that? Anybody? Any thoughts?
Well, I would say initially to be both in terms of being saved in the fire and also in terms of utilities and your home site is to if there's any way we can decentralize.
Yes. Yes.
So if you look at these big utility companies or the big water companies or whatever it is, or even to think that the fire department can make it to every home in a catastrophic event like we had the night of the Thomas Fire, it's not realistic. So the degree to which you can have, your home be fire resistant, but perhaps producing some of your own power, not having everything so dependent on the grid, having water on site, both in terms of a soil that's healthy and plants that are resistant, but also maybe if you have a water catchment system and having, I'm just pointing to this idea that we could have a large structure out there that's going to save us is probably unrealistic in the types of fires that we are experiencing at this time.
Yeah.
I can speak to what Southern California Edison's doing to prevent fires, and they have a public safety shutdown program, I think is what it's officially called, and the general idea behind it is with a forecasted weather event, winds and low humidity, they can pick specific areas that are within those forecasted areas and shut the power down ahead of time. Again, 85% of these fires are started from some kind of human cause, and part of that is a utility issue. So I I think that's very forward thinking. I always think about the prevention side and the response side. So now my response hat says, okay, great, now all the power's out. I'm trying to get people out of harm's way because it's not going to prevent every fire. I'm realistic about this. Right. I hope it prevents some. But now we're dealing with a fire in an area that doesn't have any power because they're not going to turn it back on until they get their people out in the area safely and actually put eyes on it and regenerate it. So, which can take some time. So again, going back to the Thomas Fire, that was 19 days of that weather event that would have hit the triggers for them to shut power down. How many of us can go 19 days in our homes or our businesses without power? So again, I appreciate the idea that Edison's moving forward on that, but it's going to pose some challenges on the fire side. The other thing they're doing is early detection. So they are mounting cameras and weather stations. I mean, they have poles everywhere, right? So they have great locations for that. One thing nice is public safety agencies are going to be able to tap into those that information and those cameras, which will be great for our forecasting and response side of it. But again, I appreciate what the utility companies are doing. It's not a perfect system yet. They had an opportunity on the Woolsey fire to shut down, and it was decided not to shut down. We'll see where it goes from there. But anyways, I appreciate the effort.
I will say that there was a good New York Times article that came out a week or two ago, and it was about PG&E specifically up in Northern California, and it was a very in-depth look at some of the practices that they were engaging in, and there was a lot of cutting corners in favor of profit, and they were finding that there were a lot of towers that were in extremely bad condition. They were very old. And so I do think that we need to make sure we're holding these companies accountable for going and repairing and maintaining their infrastructure and coming up with innovative ways to keep, again, those lines when they hit in the wind, that's what causes sparks, that's what causes an ignition. And without that ignition, you don't have a fire. And so I do think that these companies are large enough and have enough money that they can work towards solving that issue, and we need to hold them accountable.
Agreed, but ultimately, I think Theresa is right in that our power delivery system was designed decades ago for a large central power plant that made all the electricity and then sent it out huge distances down the wire. More and more, we don't have to have that same, and there's obviously still a time and place for that, and that's our default situation. But for example, if we move to more, say, electric cars, and our electric cars can become a storage battery at home. And if the power goes out or if we lose, they have to shut down power for, again, it's not perfect, doesn't last 19 days, but that distributed network is a much more resilient power infrastructure than big giant coal plant, which what they mostly were a fuel oil plant originally, and then string some lines through the forest. That's not the best approach. And so some of these things you can take, and again, some of these approaches, speaking to the ecological resilience of the system, aren't just for wildfire, right? If done right, these things have benefits not just for wildfire stuff, for our own health or other aspects of our world. And it's always dangerous when people talk about win-win situations. I always get very skeptical, but those can be win-win situations.
Other natural disasters too, earthquakes.
Absolutely,
and,
absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely.
So before we go on to our next question, here's the time. If you have a question, write it down on your card, and in about 10 minutes, people will come down, just down the aisles, and if you have a question, pass it down, and those questions will get asked. They'll look through those questions and then bring them up here. So we actually talked about this somewhat, and if you didn't get a chance to see this, I think how long ago? I'm not sure, like a couple months ago, it seems like, there was a panel actually here, and it was on different kinds of building materials that could be, fire and earthquake, more resilient. So I guess that's a place to start is what kinds of things are we looking at that interface that are the most promising? So one would be building materials, I guess would be a good place to start. But Bryant, you want to start there?
I guess what I'd like to do, who knows if their home is fire safe? If it's built with fire safe materials, if it's fire adapted, who knows? I'm seeing
Will better say yes.
Let the record show it's a very small number of hands that are up.
Yeah.
I think that's a problem. I think we need to learn about our own homes and whether they are fire safe. They were built with fire safe materials. You also, it helps to know if you are in a high risk area. The Cal Fire has produced these maps. They started producing these back, I think, in the early 90s, these fire hazard severity zone maps. And I think starting with, you got to know, right? Ready, set, go. A part of that is knowing about your own home. And so from there, we can figure out what is it that we need to do to change it. And there are a lot of options. And I really strongly advocate for, we start at the home and we work our way out. So if your home was built decades ago and it wasn't built with fire safe materials, the first thing you want to look at is your roof, what it's made out of. You want to look at your windows. You want to look at your siding, your vents, your eaves, your soffits, all of these things. And Will, I'm sure you can go into a lot more
Vents are
depth on this
huge.
stuff.
Vents
Yeah.
are huge.
But so
Well, I'd love to comment
Turn your
on
microphone
that
towards you,
because-
Will. You can
because-
turn it down or turn it.
There we go.
There you go.
Yeah, so we actually have on our website, and we've got a page in here that gives you our website, firesafeojai.org. And we have the Home Wildfire Safety Survey on the site. It actually steps you through a series of questions that are basic, simple, easy questions that you can answer about your own home. And at the end, it gives you a score. What's your wildfire safety score? But more than that, based on your answers, it will give you information about things that you can do to improve on areas where you need improvement. So based on your answers, it says, well, here are some things that you can do at no cost that can improve your wildfire safety score. Here are some things that you can do that may have some moderate costs, and here are some things to do that you might consider. They might be expensive, but they could really help. And so it's a great tool. It's accessible 24 hours a day. You can go to the website anytime, and there's instructions as to where to find it right here. So it's a fabulous tool for doing exactly what you're talking about. And you were about to say, or maybe I heard you say, the vents.
Yeah.
The vents are really important because, as a lot of people up here will tell you, a lot of houses burn from the inside out.
Yeah.
An ember gets in somewhere, and then the ignition starts, and this can happen several days after the fire has passed. That thing somehow just sort of keeps cooking in there until it gets hot enough to catch fire, and all of a sudden your next door neighbor's home is on fire, or your home is on fire. So vents is one of the things that special vents are made that you can buy that will prevent ember intrusion. There's all kinds of other great stuff. So
ember screens for existing vents,
right?
And you want to make sure it's the right mesh size because you can have 2 millimeter ember that can cause an ignition in your home.
Right,
and
even small ones can.
But I want to go back to when you go and look at people's houses, or when you go on some of those projects, what are the easiest things that you see that people can do right now, or what are the fixes?
Well, it's just right off the top of my head, moving your wood pile away from the house.
Right.
Excellent.
So a lot of people, it's a convenient place to stack it because when it rains, it's still covered and all that. Bad idea. There are inexpensive fixes that you can do, like, I should tell you too that something you can do to help in the event of an approaching wildfire is to get a gel kit. I got one of those in advance of the Thomas fire, and I found it useful. And it's simple to apply. You hook up your garden hose, and you can spray a gel on anything that might be flammable on or around your house. Clearing brushes. I want to make a comment too. We talk about fuel breaks, and a lot of people in their minds have this idea that you just take a bulldozer and go through and remove everything, and that is a fuel break. And that's not really what fuel breaks are. And when the Fire Safe Council contracts to do a fuel break, there's always instruction about what we call the mosaic pattern, where you're creating a fuel break that leaves things there, but in a pattern such that it doesn't carry fire easily. you want to do the same thing around your house. Trim your shrubs so that they're not tall right under your eaves, and that trees that you might have in your yard or elsewhere around your house are far enough apart from each other so that the fire doesn't have a ladder to climb to get to your house or to get to other things that are flammable. Because then you're in the middle of a big ember storm and it gets a lot harder to protect the home.
According to the science, the first 5 feet around your home are really critical. If you have anything touching the home, anything overhanging the home, if you have mulch beds up against flammable siding, those are all places that embers can land and they can cause ignition, right? If you have pine needles up on your roof, especially if you have a complex roof, you have pine needles that are on top of the roof and they're next to some siding that's on another level of the roof, that can cause an ignition and burn that siding. So I recommend to everyone, if you get a chance, you can look up Jack Cohen. He used to be a Forest Service researcher. He he ran the fire sciences lab for decades, and he's retired now. But he was kind of, I consider him sort of the grandfather of this type of work, looking at the home. And he would actually build homes in these big facilities and then blast them with embers and figure out what are the weak spots and what materials work best. And there's this great video. We have it on our website. I don't know if I can plug my website. Go ahead, lpfw.org. But it's on YouTube. Look up Jack Cohen, and I don't remember the title, but it's about keeping your home from burning during a wildfire. And he talks a lot about what Will was saying. I mean, you're moving those wood piles away. There's a lot of really inexpensive things you can do. Even if your home wasn't built with fire-safe materials, there's a lot of things that you can do right now and that you need to be doing, especially as you go into fire season consistently. And he explains it really well. So I recommend everyone to go and look that up.
Before we go on, I want to hear from others, but I'm going to ask Amanda and Misty to come down and get cards. And it's Amanda's birthday today, so you can tease her as she walks down. You didn't know you were going to have a couple hundred people.
Is there cake?
What's that?
No cake, or
there's some
beer?
cookies.
Is there beer?
There's cookies in the back. I guess I would like to hear from you, John. What are the best things people can do right now, other than what's been spoken?
I think the way I would like to explain it is being out there in my career, seeing how houses are impacted by fires. So just consider this. So there's a handful of ways the fire impacts the house. So it can creep along the ground and get to the house, direct flame impingement. It can be an ember that travels 3/4 of a mile, like we've already talked about. So it could be a little bit larger flame, somewhere in between that creeping fire and that wind-driven ember, as far as flame length goes. So just consider how a fire from the outside is going to affect your house. So the ember's it can go anywhere on any level of the house, very small opening, it can get inside, and it's already been mentioned, the inside-out fire. That ember gets inside the attic, typically, is where they seem to be up higher, or under a door, or an open window. So consider all the openings to the outside and how you mitigate that. Vents they're there for a reason, for air to go through, so you just bring your screen size down a little bit smaller, and there's plenty of documentation to figure out what size that is. Combustibles around the house, it's been mentioned. So that creeping fire that comes along, it's just creeping along in small grass, and then it gets to the wood pile. Not a good thing. So pool equipment, anything that can burn, get it away from the house. And it sounds like a 5-foot buffer. Is that what you've seen? It makes sense.
I recommend. I mean, seriously, if anyone knows of John Davis, he has a home that survived the Thomas Fire, and his home was featured in Time magazine. They had a really great video, and he explained how he designed his home. And I think he had a few feet of a gravel buffer around the home. I think that's really smart. Actually.
Yeah. So the other thing we saw on the Thomas Fire, I didn't mention it as a takeaway, but all the mulch we're putting around our houses in an effort to be more water-wise with our landscaping. If we don't keep it moist, it's another fuel source, and it's so small, and you put wind on it, it's getting underneath the thresholds of the doors. So you may have your door closed and think you've done everything you can, and you drive away and you wonder why the house burned down. A lot of times what we were seeing on the Thomas was that mulch that got blown by the wind and got inside the house. So it's all about the openings. Radiant heat is another component to think about. So if you have, where your windows are, depending on what your window dressings are made out of, if it's combustible, that's a recommendation to replace them with something that's non-combustible. We can go on and on if we want.
Well, either maybe for Will or you, what we looked at is I saw where the fire came down into the valley, and then it seemed to stop at some citrus orchards, right, that were irrigated. So is that in general, do we find that agriculture that's irrigated tends to stop the fire from advancing, or either?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we're looking at controlling a wildfire, we're looking at man-made barriers, natural barriers, and a natural barrier. Well, I guess that could be either one of them, right? An orchard, but yeah, absolutely, a well-maintained orchard that's getting the proper water, and we'll make a stand there, or we will, use either side of it as a potential starting point to move along the edge. But absolutely, they're in favor for controlling a wildfire.
And I will say is, we hear a kind of a push to make more orchards around towns, and I'll just say something to consider. Again, ecological trade-offs, right? Water use in an area where we have very little water. How is that going to impact that? What landscape do you need to replace with that orchard? These are things that you want to consider and determine that cost benefit in terms of ecological effects.
One of the things I was surprised at during the Woolsey fire was my son's Boy Scout troop was, we do a benefit for a gentleman that passed away several years ago. So there was a bike race through the Santa Monica. So we were right next to the Calamigos Ranch, which is in the middle of the Santa Monica. It's kind of a big wedding venue with a gazillion million eucalyptus trees, everything they can burn on the planet. They can have like 6 or 7 weddings, like gigante weddings going at the same time, and there's a huge place. The fire was moving right towards there, and there was one of the TV crews was showing it, and I said, "Oh my God, that place is gone!" Because we had walked around the place a week and a half or so before, and they lost 1 or 1.5 outbuildings. That was it. And how they persisted was they have, and we can't all do this, but it really drove home the importance of even just shifting things slightly, which is they have some ponds on their property, giant impact sprinkler heads, really, really high up, already set up. And as soon as the fire came, they flicked them on. And so they weren't using the water to put out the fire, per se. They were using the impact sprinkler heads to increase the relative humidity around these vulnerable structures. And so it was enough such that when an ember would land, it wouldn't instantly boosh and then so it'd give folks time to go and put it out. And it was a really interesting example of, again, we're not all going to do that. We don't all have a massive pond in our backyards, but it was very interesting how even just a slight tilting of the odds towards giving a chance to get stuff under control made a huge difference.
Yeah, we have a real technical term for that in the fire service. It's called a water curtain. And actually, that's what it is. We'll use it, the big deck gun that you see on a fire truck. We'll use that in a situation like that at times.
Talking about water, I guess this might be for John again, but is our water infrastructure sufficient? What did you find in fighting the fire? Was water an issue?
Water was an issue at times. Maybe a way to explain this, I think what most of us may believe is that the fire department's out there just putting a ton of water on homes trying to save them during a Thomas fire. I'm speaking of a Thomas fire situation. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, our priority is always going to save lives, right? So a lot of times, most of the time during the first 12, 18 hours of the Thomas fire, to save a life meant you had to put the resident in the fire truck and drive them to safety. There was no time to put water on the house. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't any water applied. There was a lot of water applied. So we were balancing that effort, right? So if you came up a street and you had 12 houses and you had 1 fire truck, and normally we would have had 20 fire trucks, but because of the drawdown from the Stucco fire that drove toward the city of Ventura, we had our challenges, right? So I can speak to the Upper Ojai. We didn't have necessarily challenges with the water supply, but no, again, our fire water supplies, they're not designed to open every fire hydrant and pump thousands of gallons per minute at one time. It's just not practical, for one. They're designed so your fire department can show up on a single house fire and have enough adequate water supply to extinguish it and maybe a neighboring house if that's the case. But it's not designed to open every hydrant and put the water curtains up, right?
Right.
So.
No, I get it. I want to suggest CAPS TV made I forgot what the film is called, but it's about the Thomas fire, and there's a lot of stories. And you guys are both on? Hey, perfect. Yeah. And they talk about driving people to this safe place, going back and getting more people and coming back. It's actually quite moving.
You can just say, think about water, which isn't water supply, But water is incredibly important in our future going forward. And so having sustainable water systems is really important. A lot of that gets to us using less water for our regular day-to-day things so that we can have it more available. We've been super blessed. We've super lucked out with the rain last year and this year. We didn't have that in the wake of the Springs fire, Camarillo Springs fire that hit our campus in 2013, and massive. The system is still completely screwed. It's still coming back, and so water, yes, and fire hydrants, but we also need water in our environment, and that turns out to be a really important thing. We haven't paid as much attention to it historically because we've been in this historic condition where rains typically came. So we have a rule of thumb that you have to, when you're doing a construction project, you have to have your erosion control stuff down by October 15th. It doesn't necessarily start then, but that's because we're expecting rains to start in October and then a little bit more in November, and then that in this climate changed era, we're getting more intense dumping when it does rain, and then more extended periods of drought. And that extended periods of drought is a problem because all of our ecology, all of our science based on the recovery of these systems, be it chaparral, be it forest, whatever, is based on the assumption that we do get some water so that the vegetation, either the erosion control seeds that are blasted on the hillside to try to stabilize that hillside so it doesn't erode onto your house, or just the trees and shrubs and birds and everybody coming back. That pops back, and so when we don't have that, that's particularly problematic. So it's been almost ideal how it's played out this year, very fortunately, but we won't always be that lucky in having this sort of relatively, Montecito aside, relatively gentle rains coming in. And in fact, we've now created a new forecast tool. We don't create forecast tool too often. So now Scripps Institute now has a scale to measure what we used to call pineapple expresses. Now we call them atmospheric rivers. We now, for the first time, have a ranking, and that's a really interesting thing you guys should pay attention to, because it's not just a weather phenomenon. It's also paying attention to the ground. So if a wildfire has come through and burned an area and made hillsides particularly bare, that will influence I think it's a 1 to 5 scale in terms of the intensity of this rain event. And so they're taking into account the potential erosion that might happen because of wildfires. So you guys can check that. Just like when we have a hurricane coming in or whatever, we have a forecast. You can now look at that in terms of the big winter rain events.
Can I go back actually to the first question of this section?
Yep.
So one thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially after the campfire up in Paradise. So I grew up on the edge of Tornado Alley, and what every neighborhood had in my hometown was a tornado shelter. It was usually a school. It was usually a gym of some sort, and it was built to withstand an extreme, event, a tornado event. And the sirens would come on, and the tornado warning, you'd see it on the TV, or you'd get the alert, and you'd load up in the car and you'd go down to the tornado shelter, a few blocks away, ideally. I think people are looking into this, but I really think that community shelters, similarly for wildfires, are something that we should be really thinking about and looking in the future toward, because what we saw with the Paradise situation with the campfire was people couldn't evacuate quickly enough. And ideally, you would have a place that is, we can build a fireproof structure that is able to filter, air in a way that, you're not just breathing in smoke. People should be able to get to those places, something that they can get to very quickly and shelter in place in those types of shelters. So it's something that we don't often talk about a lot, but it is something I've been thinking about.
Our nearest equivalent, I guess, would be Nordhoff, right? And that's sort of how it was used.
Nordhoff was used that way,
yeah.
As an evacuation.
Right.
I think it's also important, so that's a fantastic idea. I like that idea. I think it's also important to look at to not have too much ego and to look to other places, wildfire being one, but other natural disasters. One of the things we first deployed, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think it's the first time in California we'd applied it, which is contraflow in the Woolsey fire. And so that's this idea that's emanated a few decades ago in the southern U.S. for hurricanes, when all of a sudden you need to evacuate a city really quickly. how do you get people out when the roads are plugged? And so what happened in the case of Woolsey Fire came, and just to remind folks, so Simi Valley, where that started, if we got on the freeway and drove to the beach in Malibu, you're talking about an hour-ish, right, on the freeway. That fire went from there to the Pacific Ocean in 4 hours. So, incredibly fast. And so when people heard about it, like, oh my God, I'm leaving. And some people went that way and some people went that way. And sure enough, pretty quickly, PCH was frozen and people couldn't go anywhere. And people were running out of gas and all the things that happen in other disasters. After, I can't remember how many hours, the authorities said, hey, screw that. We're going to go just have all lanes of traffic, no matter if they're northbound, southbound, whatever, go away from the fire. And that was the thing that really freed up the roads and allowed it. So shelters, all these other things that we can learn from our friends and colleagues elsewhere, even if it doesn't say wildfire on it, could be really, really useful to helping get people out safely and protect property and things.
And the other thing that's being evacuated at least in the Upper Ojai, what I saw, because when I left home, I went to Summit. People are evacuating their horses,
right,
their livestock. I mean, horses don't like fire, so they don't evacuate cooperatively.
Right.
So I think, again, in looking at these situations, we have to look at diverse plans,
yeah,
and we have to be prepared in our own site for a diversity of approaches.
Yeah.
So diverse ways that we're holding water on the land, diverse ways that we are using water and maybe gray water or stormwater catchment, or ways, again, not looking at the superstructure or, we were lucky in the Upper Ojai that it is a small community, so we were able to evacuate, but looking, not counting on, as John was saying, the fire hydrants aren't designed to be able to withstand what we had on December 4th and 5th, and that went on for a number of days. So looking for that diverse plan, looking at your own site, and not counting on the corporation or the fire department. I mean, not that they aren't going to come if they can, but you can't count on that being there.
Right.
And can I just say, I think we're going to end the questions. Just so I have disagreements with county and bureaucracies and stuff like that, just like all of us do. But I think we're talking about how we can get better, and we absolutely can get a lot better, and we need to get a lot better. But I think sometimes when we're somewhere, we don't realize how good we have it at times. So I work in parts of the world that would dream of having the facilities and the thinking and the planning that we have going on here. And a fantastic example of that was during the Woolsey Fire. I keep talking about the Woolsey Fire, sorry. But the Woolsey Fire just a few months ago, which burned essentially right down the Ventura, Los Angeles County line. So so we have mutual aid, and everybody works together, right, to get the fires out. But what you see more after the first few hours or so is the work that our county, our representatives and other folks have put together. So what you saw on all the television channels and stuff, where was the evacuation zones? Ventura County were all of these lines in this neighborhood and that neighborhood and whatever. Los Angeles County, not really. That's because our folks in our county have realized that one of the things to help people get safe is to have products, stuff you can see on your phone, and if you're a technical person, you get some of the shape files and things, but put it out in every which way possible so that the folks in the news media and whatever can grab that and make it available to you. LA County doesn't have that. LA County has the classic thing where it's a line of text, and from street, no, to street, no, and you're like, what the hell? So as a consequence, when you need that initial, not 4 or 5 days later once the graphics people have had a chance to do something, but instantly when you're trying to figure out, should I leave my neighborhood, or when you're stuck at work trying to figure out if your family is safe, that's when we need this information transparent and really out there, and our county has done a lot and I know we can always be better, but we're really in a lucky place where people are interested in our county. Not only they've done some great stuff, but also we're interested in getting better. And again, that's not always the case in various jurisdictions where I work. So we're lucky in that sense.
Yeah,
I do feel it is a good system. Could it be better? Absolutely. It can never be fast enough. I mean, that is our biggest challenge on the public safety side as far as messaging out. But it does speak to the coordination that happens prior to these events. And we're still talking. We talk every day for the most part with other agencies within the county. And we have, the key to that is the overarching agency, which is under the Sheriff's Department. It's the Office of Emergency Services. And that particular segment of the Sheriff's Department brings all of our agencies, fire, animal services. You mentioned evacuating horses. That can be one of our biggest challenges, is making sure the livestock is out. Because we will not get that homeowner out if that pet can't go, and we all get that, right? So, so it's a collaboration piece. There's some technology sides to it. So I'm glad you said that, Sean. It does make it feel like we're actually doing something good here. But it also speaks to the collaboration of everyone here, the communities themselves, and I think that's one of the reasons we're speaking about this is to get more interest, try and educate people, think about ideas outside the box. We talked about our water system is not designed to open every fire hydrant. Our roads aren't designed to evacuate us all out of here in 1 hour. It's just not. I mean, we will do our best and we will make it all go one way in a coordinated effort. But add in the horses and add in everything else. So where we thought prior to maybe the Thomas fire and Woolsey fire that, you give us a fire, we'll get everyone out of here. Okay, well, what if the road's blocked off? I mean, all the what ifs? So we have to have a combination or a hybrid system, sheltering in place. Maybe it's a partnership with our schools. And guess what? Maybe we get state, federal money to build gymnasium, multi-purpose buildings that become a shelter for our communities.
Win-win again. There you go.
Yeah, there you go. And we get some basketball players out of the deal. Who knows? But that's what it takes. It's collaboration at all of our levels. And if we can get that energy going and just leverage the recent fires, I hate to mention it, but earthquakes happen here too. And it's been a while, but we don't want to necessarily forecast those, but another situation where we could be as a community here in a valley where all of our accesses are blocked from an earthquake, mudslide, you name it. We may have to rely on other systems that we don't quite have built out yet, but we're open for suggestions for sure.
Theresa, you were going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say that the night of the fire, when I was trying to sleep at the Ventura Fairgrounds with my dog in the car, I was listening to the fire, what do you call it, John?
Scanner? The radio channels?
Yeah. And what I was the most reassured by is when you'd hear someone, they'd go and open up the hydrant and no water came out. They did not react at all the way I would have reacted if I opened it. There was this extreme calm and collaboration and cooperation that was, as I said, reassuring, and so thank you for that.
Yeah.
Hey, you're welcome. And that brings up a point. We were talking with one of the the East End Neighborhood Association, I think it's called. Some of you may be part of that. But myself and Jim Fryhoff, the police chief of the City of Ojai, we were invited to speak to this, and the big discussion was messaging. You guys just couldn't get the message out quick enough about evacuation, where the fire is, and everything else. And one person in the back said, I was getting pretty good information, and what it was someone listening to the scanner, and you can get them on your phone. It's an app, right?
Yeah, it's an app.
You're hearing us on the radio saying, hey, the fire's heading here, it's done this, it's going here, this is our next move, this is our plan, and we articulate that on the radio. This person was hearing that, but sorry.
VC Scanner. It's on Twitter.
It's VC Scanner, but someone that didn't have it, they were texting that in some other app, and that's where the person was getting. Well, that person doing it was in England, but the person benefiting from it was living in the east end of Ojai. But that's my point is, if you want good information, consider that as one of your sources.
And Twitter, I mean, you can hashtag the fire's name.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good, and then go to so it's the latest.
Yeah.
Just one disclaimer though. The official message will come on the fire department or law enforcement's website, so just consider that.
Don't believe everything you see on the internet.
I will say that my sister called me because I can't remember which website it was, but if you zoomed way out or you zoomed way in, it showed the hot spots, and then when you zoomed out, it didn't change the size of the circle on one. So it looked like downtown was on fire, right? So that's what my sister called me in a panic. So that's a case that it didn't work. Moving on, there was an article in the Ojai Valley News last issue by Kit Stoltz, our friend, and basically talking about some people who stayed, defended their home, and other people left. And I guess, Theresa, I'd like to start with you and then maybe go to Will. What kind of conversation could we have around that, whether you should stay or go?
I would say in a firestorm, don't stay. In a fire, stay. So as I said, the Thomas fire was the fourth fire that hit us, and we had stayed in previous fires and been able to get out, put out embers. If we didn't have water, we could stomp them out. In the Thomas fire, I described what I experienced. At the same time, there were limbs breaking off of trees going across the driveway, and so I saw that I had a window to get out, and I took it. But my nephew was at Thomas Aquinas, and both he and other people I talked to who were in Ventura when the fire hit were describing embers the size of basketballs moving horizontally. So it wasn't your typical fire where if you protected your roof, or they were coming down gently. These big, basketball-sized embers were going horizontally through windows. And when I witnessed what was happening in Ventura up on the hillsides, looking up at it, houses were exploding. They weren't catching on fire, and the fire was growing. It was a very, very different event. And I would say an event like that, if that is coming at you, then, if you live, great. If you can save your house, great. But I think what we saw in Northern California with so many people dying, what we saw at Paradise, all the oxygen is being sucked out of the air by the intensity of the fire, which it was very intense that night because of the wind, then, your life's worth more. I actually felt saddened by, and also I don't remember who it was from NPR that interviewed me at the Red Cross after the fire, but her biggest concern was that the idea that you should stay. And again, I think it's an individual choice, and if you can assess your situation. My nephew was near a pond. He knew he could jump in the pond. So part of it's going to be your particular landscape, your escape route, whether or not you have easy access to someplace you can be safe. Other than that,
Thank you. Will, what do you think?
Well, I was struck by my own experience. When I went to grab all the things that you're supposed to grab, and one of the things that I noticed was that there really wasn't that much that I really just had to save. The important papers, the birth certificates and things like that. And it all fit in my car. So losing our home is a huge thing, and you don't ever really want to even think about it. But being there for your family, being alive, is a much bigger deal than anything you might find in your home. Now, that said, on a pragmatic level, if you're prepared, if you've gone to the Fire Safe Council website and done the online education that's available.
Wait, what's the website again? One more time.
And if you are, if you've got a great source of information and you feel you're really aware of the situation, and you're physically able-bodied, and you feel in your best judgment, and with the advice of people who are elsewhere, they're calling you in, and they're looking at the maps on TV and that kind of stuff, then it's something to consider, but consider it carefully. Because homes can be rebuilt, things can be replaced, people cannot. It's that simple.
And this is not just an issue. So this is every single time we have a natural disaster. So we work a lot in hurricane areas. It's the same thing. There's people are using their past experience to say that, that last hurricane, that last fire was okay. I stayed and it was okay, or I should have stayed because it wasn't as bad. That's very dangerous going into the future. I think it's also, and so I think what Will said is exactly right. If, then possibly. One of the things that makes me worried is as we, in different areas, as we allow development, when the whole entire plan for evacuation is to not evacuate, that we're only going to put this house or this series of houses, this development in, and the only way to get them safe is to have them shelter in place, that makes me extremely worried. And as these large fires showed, there isn't a perfect place to shelter. And if the only option or the default option and the number 1, 2, 3, and 4 option is to shelter in place, I wouldn't live there. I wouldn't let my family live there. And so I strongly encourage shelter in place when we need to, because the conditions or whatever, if we have a safe design structure to withstand stuff, but more often than not. So in my neighborhood during the Woolsey fire, I went around and counted. I was with some fire folks and counted before the evacuation was lifted. It's about 10% of my neighborhood did not evacuate, and this is suburbia. This is wasn't some special fire safe place. Or wasn't their ranch they were trying to defend. It was just houses, and that's deeply concerning because one, it's just dangerous, but two, that means that if something goes wrong, I guarantee those folks are going to call the fire guys and say, "Hey, come save our butts," when there are other things going on. And I think a really interesting contrast going forward is going to be Paradise versus Malibu. That very similar in some senses impacts, and by and large, Paradise mostly folks without a lot of economic wherewithal. Malibu, by and large, mostly folks with a lot of wherewithal, and how those things have played out have been very interesting. So all kinds of public meetings where folks were irate in Malibu why there wasn't not a fire truck in their neighborhood. Why wasn't there a fire truck on my front lawn defending my place? And some of my firefighter friends have told me stories. I won't say where, but where they were working on a gentleman's house. A fire was coming down. They were trying to save the house, and then they got a call that someone was stuck in a building, or potentially stuck in a building, some blocks away. So they started unhooking the hoses and started getting ready to run. And the homeowner said, "What the hell are you doing?" He said, "Oh, we got somebody that might be stuck in his house." I said, "Well, he heard the evacuation. Screw that guy. My house right here. You're defending my house right here." And so those kinds of things come up more and more when we don't actually think about how we're going to evacuate, and they take us to bad places. And I would like to minimize there will always be some of that, but we should try to minimize that as much as possible. Small fire, small embers, things under control, that seems to be one thing possibly. But to default, just say everybody should shelter in place, I don't think that is a smart thing.
Well, yeah, and I want to jump in here and add that, we've got the Ready, Set, you guys probably all have a brochure, the Ready, Set, Go brochure, the program that was created by County Fire. The Fire Safe Council adopted it. It's a fabulous program. And, so much of this is psychological, right? Whether you stay or go. And so if you do the ready piece, and again, online, educate yourself, get yourself ready, have your family safety plan on the fridge, all the stuff that's in here that we're recommending you do, get yourself as ready as you possibly can be, so that when the time comes to make that decision, you're not thinking, "Oh, I got to stay because I gotta maybe, trim those hedges or whatever it is. I gotta hang around." It's like you've done your homework. You know what the situation is. You've got your kit ready to go. You throw it in the trunk, and it's an easy call. I'm going to leave now. I've done what I need to do. I know my wood pile's away from the house. I've moved all the furniture away from the house. I've got, I've done everything I can to make my house as savable as possible. And that takes me back to the discussion about the fuel break and the 100-foot defensible space. They call that defensible space for a reason. It's a place where firefighters can stand to defend your house. That's why it's called defensible space. If you don't have that, the firefighters are great, but they're not fireproof. And their suits are fabulous, but but they won't walk into burning brush to get the hose over closer to your house.
Yeah.
So what you got to do is in advance make sure that you're doing all that work and you've done all the, you checked all the boxes, and then when it's time to make the call, you feel like, okay, I've done everything I can. I'm going to leave this up to the powers that be, and I'm out of here. And it's much easier to drive away.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
I do, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's representing the fire department, of course. It's a Ready, Set, Go program, and the go means when ordered, directed, however it comes across. The expectation is that you go. We do struggle with compliance. It was 10% compliance in your
90% compliance, 10% stayed.
10 non-compliance.
That's actually pretty good in today's standards. So, because it is a challenge, and I think it's a challenge because Theresa, she mentioned it. She's comfortable. She knows her house. She's been through the ranch fire probably. Mm-hmm. She's got some history up there. My concern is when the homeowner makes the decision: is this one that's gonna, is this another Thomas or a Woolsey fire, or is this something quite a bit less? My concern is they're making that. If the officials, and we do not take this lightly, this is one of our biggest challenges when we're managing an incident that has evacuations associated with it, or even sheltering in place. But what I can assure you is it's well thought out, and we have tools that we're getting. Every year we're updating all the tools that we use to where we can pinpoint locations, and we're not just, the easy button was just, hey, just evacuate all of Upper Ojai. Well, that's going to be tough because 150 going towards Santa Paula is completely closed. So how are we going to get it? So there's a lot of thought behind it. One point I want to make on the Thomas, I don't know the exact Woolsey numbers, but 90,000 people evacuated in the first 5 hours. 2 fatalities on the Thomas, 3 on the Woolsey. Yes, some of those were associated with evacuations. I get that part. That's the ironic part of it. But when you look at all the stats, the Woolsey and the Thomas are on largest, they're on most destructive, but they don't hit the charts on the most deadly. Mm-hmm. And that speaks to the evacuation piece. It speaks to the Ready, Set, Go piece. It speaks to you in the audience and our communities. Just because you weren't ordered to evacuate, people left. People got it. They watched the news, they heard the messages, they smelt the smoke, they did whatever it took to talk themselves into doing the right thing, and that was get out of harm's way. So it's definitely a joint effort, and it's not a perfect system on the fire side and law enforcement side to deliver the message, but the numbers, the fatalities, although tragic, do speak to some of the successes that we're having with these fires.
Thank you.
And one last thing real quick, I'll just say, you can't do stuff for other people, you can't make their go kit or whatever, but you can check on your neighbors, particularly our elderly folks that, so sometimes when we talk about why didn't these people evacuate, sometimes it's a choice, but sometimes they just can't physically. Either they don't have transportation or they don't have the wherewithal or whatever to do that. And so if we do have particularly elderly neighbors, great to check with them maybe ahead of time, and on your way out, if it's safe, I would also go check to see if he or she, we got room in our car. In my case, there's all kinds of room in our car because my wife saves my hard drive and then nothing else I own. It's everything my son ever touched, the 5th grade thing, and then whatever. It's like, what the hell is this doing in here? Like, So if need be, we could shove some of that out to grab one of our elderly neighbors. Yeah. And so I would encourage you guys to have those conversations at 4th of July barbecue or something like, hey, you good with getting
That's
out
really
if
good.
something happens?
And the one thing I would add to that as well is that even if you stay and you're able to save your house, what you are breathing in that process isn't necessarily life-supporting.
Yeah. Let me go to a question. So apparently a lot of people ask this question. Burying power lines, would this be helpful? Is it prohibitively expensive or impossible?
Yes. It would be helpful. It would be helpful, totally. But to the scale at which a neighborhood is one thing, a development is one thing, but the cost is extremely high for places like Ojai. If we're talking about middle of Ventura or something, that's a different economies of scale. And by burying this, how many houses or how many folks would be protected? Whereas here we're so distributed, it's mostly cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have been in meetings with Edison specifically on this topic, and I spoke about the public safety shutdown program. They are putting a lot of effort, at least in the discussion, of making the system more resilient, right? And a lot of that is going underground. It is the most costly thought in their resiliency. So they're replacing poles that are going to keep lines above ground with fire resistive or fireproof poles, because as we know, a lot of them are wood. But going underground, I mean, think about the high tension lines that run from Kenyatta Larga across when we go down to the start of the freeway down there.
Right.
Consider putting those underground. My gosh, I mean, we're trying to get a water system to connect Casitas with Ventura, and think about what's happening on that, trying to bury that pipe to do that. So,
Yeah.
yes, and yes, I absolutely agree with you.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to ask a little bit of a harder question. Please address the recent, the recent inclusion of 440,000 acres of Ventura County in the wildlife corridor, which greatly limit vegetation management. It seems to increase fire hazard.
Yes, so I can speak to that since
Yes.
I was an advocate of that, and I wrote a letter to the county supervisors advocating for that, and I've been part of the discussions for the last 2-3 years for that.
Advocating for the corridor.
Advocating for
Okay.
the
Yep.
And so for people that know, just real quick, so this is for unincorporated areas of the county where we have known wildlife corridors. So we've been doing a 14-year study on roadkill across the county that goes from the Santa Barbara county line up to Santa Clarita down to West LA and those areas. And so huge numbers of our critters die on our roads every year. We're talking like 50,000 animals sort of in and out, but they don't die equally everywhere. So there are certain areas where, because you're near a riparian corridor, near a wetland or whatever, that we see more deaths. And that's because there's certain areas that are just easier for critters to move from place to place. And so the idea of this particular ordinance was for again, areas outside of city control, to foster, to protect what remains of our wildlife corridor. So if you happen to have a property or a business in that area, this new ordinance going into the county policy is to limit certain things you can do. So for example, you have to have wildlife permeable fencing. You can still have your chicken coops and stuff like that, but across your property there needs to be a way for deer, mountain lions, whatever to go through, things like lighting, etc. So part of that, one subcomponent of that is to not clear everything. So that some of our critters do better with not everybody will cross a naked plain. And so some critters will move from shrub to shrub and things of that nature. And so one of the elements of that is to not do extensive brush clearing in these areas that are identified as wildlife corridors. And so one of the questions that was brought up is, hey, so isn't this going to be a problem? Because if we can't clear vegetation, won't that potentially be more problematic in terms of wildfire? In theory, anything could happen, but it's much more likely that these other practices we've talked about, the other structure protection and et cetera, are at least as important as this one vegetative management thing. And simply having a vegetative management program isn't going to guarantee that we do or don't have a fire coming up to us. So this is one of those cases where I mentioned before that we have to think about things in the larger context, that wildfire is but one part of it. I would also argue that having vibrant, healthy organisms, ecosystems, are also really, really helpful and important. And so I wouldn't want fire to trump everything. I don't think other things should always trump fire. And so I think it's a balancing act is what it ultimately comes down to. But ultimately, this is not the entirety of the county. These are relatively narrow areas and relatively narrow overlay. It's not all of Ventura County. And so given that, I don't see it as massively promoting wildfire. Most of these corridors are near or associated with, not all, but many of them with water features, riparian corridors. And those are the areas that are least likely to burn. And I could go on for hours, but I should probably be quiet.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I was a big part of that as well. I was at those hearings and advocated and wrote letters. And I think there's two things. One, the fire department actually weighed in during that process and said that the corridors weren't going to pose any problems for fire mitigation efforts. So just get that out of the way first. And second, it's not even as much as you say 440,000. That was actually before. That actually included a lot of corridors that were in the Los Padres that weren't on private land, and so it's actually a much smaller number than that. And again, I think this shows our fixation on vegetation management. And as Sean just said, focusing on the structure, focusing on that area immediately around the structure are as important, if not more important. So I think that speaks to that.
And what I would add to that is that in these graphs that we got that showed death and destruction, if we actually looked at the destruction to the animals that live in the wild, it's extremely high.
Yes.
And so that whatever we can do to support them in making a comeback, that would include the corridors, that would include putting native plants in our landscapes. Whatever we can do, I think we owe it to other species.
John, any contrary thoughts or agreeing thoughts?
Well, it was a fairly controversial ordinance that was presented. The ranchers had their opinion on it. Fire did weigh in and was in the early discussions with it. We just wanted to make sure we still had some abilities to do some vegetation management within those corridors. And there was some, I don't know if there were compromises, but there was good discussion back and forth. And
It evolved.
It did evolve. So it's about finding that balance, right? And yeah.
And one last thing to speak to that. I don't like forced options, to be completely honest. I like for us to choose what we're trying to do. One of the reasons we have to go to this wildlife corridor is because of all the development that has happened in certain areas, because of the choices we made before. So I would argue when we're talking about wildfire here, things that might not seem like they're about wildfire can become about wildfire. I would wish we wouldn't have to have some stupid endangered species law and stuff like that, right? But the fact that we have nuked these populations forces us into these things. So thinking ahead and very broad will keep us from getting into these difficult decisions and avoid that in the first place. But we are dealt the world we're dealt with right now, so we have to deal with that going forward. But there will be more forced options if we don't take more adult decisions on various things.
Thank you. Another question. Is a wet winter a risk because of an increased fuel load? Maybe in the following a year from then.
So I'll just say I had a student that looked at a study. So one of the things that I found interesting was when we have a dry year, a lot of times, CAL FIRE comes out, it's going to be a horrible fire year. And then we have a wet year, it's going to be a horrible fire year. And it always seems to be going to be a horrible fire year. So we went and we looked at newspaper articles around the state for the last, I don't remember what it was, 75 years or something, or some odd number of time. And the question was, is there a correlation with the warnings that came out with the extent, the acreage of wildfire burn? And the answer was there wasn't. There was a correlation with the amount of destruction, so the cost. So if CAL FIRE said, oh my gosh, it's gonna be a really bad fire year, there was more destruction, but there was more cost associated with the repairs or whatever was damaged. But there wasn't necessarily more acreage taken up.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to point out something going to acreage. Actually, this is a little bit of a tangent, but something to consider as you look at fire perimeter data through the years. Now we use a lot more backfiring operations as part of fire suppression efforts, and there are some fires where 20% of the acreage burned is actually from backfire operations, and so there is an issue and there's a research gap there in terms of how much bigger a fire is getting, how much of that is being driven by backfiring. So just keep that in mind. It's something I meant to point out earlier. But yeah.
Thank you.
I think the immediate results of the rain we're getting, we're going to see grasses. Mm-hmm. Grasses are much easier to manage from a fire standpoint. It also, on the positive side, it will bring the fuel moistures within the heavier fuels, the trees, the bigger brush, up, hopefully out of the critical ranges. And so there's good and bad, and that's probably why CAL FIRE says it's going to be a bad grass crop, or not, a good grass crop, but could cause acreage grass acreage burn. But it should help us on the larger fuels.
So when we see the hills right now, they look green and wonderful. In just a couple months, they're going to be brown.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not going to be good. Here's a very tactical question, but they need help. How do we fireproof our propane tank?
Ooh, wow, good one.
Remove it.
That question.
Remove it?
No.
Are there any experts in here?
We've actually there's short answer is there's no way to fireproof the tank. If it's exposed to enough heat, it's going to blow. But you can clear around it. You can make sure that there's nothing around it that is flammable. We actually have gone in some of our work to do vegetation management. We've seen propane tanks that were hidden away by hedges and things that were just ripe for creating an explosion. So just get things away from it if you have to keep it there. And if you really wanted to be more proactive about it, you could build a cinder block structure around it to protect it from heat.
Yeah, it's a good question because those and car tires are probably the scariest sounds you hear when you're out there dealing with these things. And every once in a while, a propane tank will take on such a rise in temperature that the built-in systems, because they all have built-in systems that will off-gas or release the pressure, and that's not a fun sound to hear either. But just keeping the heat away from it. So if you're prepping your house and you have a propane tank, and we have them in barbecues, don't forget the small ones for in your garages for camping, or if you do any kind of soldering or whatnot. You just get them to a location that's not close to the fire, and if you can build kind of a safe area for all that, but paints and everything else. I mean, there's a lot of flammables out there and explosives that things that could explode.
A couple of people asked questions about communications, but I have an idea. Not everybody knew about all the means of communication, as we were talking about here, like Twitter and that kind of stuff. So maybe what we can do as a follow-up, an email can go out that can have all of those links, which I'll get from you guys.
Yeah.
Well, that was symbolic of something. I don't know what it was.
My sign fell. It lasted almost.
So one of the things we work on with my son's scout troop, and also we're starting to teach a class on it. Field professionalism is communication. So it's great that we all have our cell phones, but I think you should expect those to go down. So hand crank radios, so you guys could be hearing stuff, but also a ham radio is if you were up in a canyon, I would seriously consider getting ham radio. There are issues with that as well, but when everybody and their brother couldn't get cell phone coverage in Malibu, whatever, our colleagues that had those personal radios could easily talk to everybody and could get information. So I think it's also not just what you have, but also if you have a diversity of sources of information is really key.
Have any of you seen examples of sirens being used for wildfires specifically?
I have not.
Okay. Is that something that's being talked about in any of your circles?
It is. Everything's outside the box right now because it's we're getting tested with it. So, it is.
It's another Tornado Alley thing, yeah.
Yeah, and if tornadoes had wildfires or wildfires had tornadoes, you can see where we could duplicate our efforts here. But just to answer the question on the Ready, Set, Go handout, the very last page, there's some websites associated with some of that question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm bringing up this question because this was news to me. I had not heard this. We're told to be mindful about water conservation, and part of that advice has been to have mulched in the area around your house or whatever, so you're not using it with water. So I heard you say that's an issue if it's dry. So I'm just saying it again so everybody gets it. That was an aha for me.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, everything we're talking about has a balance to it, right?
But I would say a buried mulch bed in a gray water system. So in a gray water system, you would have the gray water going in, you'd have a sort of area dug, you'd have mulch down in there, then that would be covered, and then that would be covered again. So it would not. That would be moist. That would be moist, and it wouldn't be on the surface.
And at the very least, having that mulch bed away from the side of the home can be a good step in the right direction.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. So with our last 3 minutes, I'm going to ask probably the easiest question. How can we hold SCE accountable? My understanding is they will likely pass lawsuit costs onto customers. Accurate?
Well, I think it isn't just the cost that we're talking about here, or people being, people having some attempt to cover their expenses. I think what we saw with SCE was some neglect before the fire, and one of the reasons I think the lawsuit could be effective is big corporations don't tend to respond to pleas. They tend to respond to things that hit them in the pocket. And so in that sense, if the lawsuit made them more accountable, not just for, say, shutting down the grid the night of the fire, but for the maintenance of lines. I mean, in the Upper Ojai, we saw all kinds of places where trees were touching power lines. And that hadn't been the case, I would say, 10 or 15 years ago. So something shifted where more of the funding was going to the top and less of the funding was going to adequately maintaining the structure.
And I would say, if you have an issue with accountability for these companies, I would strongly recommend that you talk to your elected official at the state level, so your assembly member or your senator, because they have actually been dealing with legislation that looks at this, and so that's going to keep coming back up, and they need to hear from you if you have thoughts. You're their constituents, and they need to know how you feel about this.
I think we all got tested. Your fire department, Edison was part of that. Our community got tested. But I think the real test is what happens moving forward.
Right.
So, where they pass on their needs, we'll see.
Because even when we were talking about burying power lines, I can't imagine that would cost more than what they're facing now because of the fire.
Agreed.
Right?
Yeah.
Agreed.
Obviously, that's hindsight, but maybe that would be a cost that we would be willing to accept in our rates to see those lines get buried.
I mean, there's innovative solutions out there. We may not have figured them out yet, but we have done some amazing things as humans, and I think that the solutions are there somewhere, and we need to work to find those.
Yeah, and I would just say prevention is almost always cheaper than the consequences.
Sure.
And I am extremely disappointed at some of the conversation around this stuff, where people say things like, "We can't afford to deal with this." There's a technical term for that. It's bullshit. Because it will, as we saw, right? We saw right here. If we don't deal with these problems now, they are going to come. They are going to be extremely expensive, and they're going to be society-ripping scale of events. I don't want to spend a lot of money. We don't want to spend a lot of money, but I would rather do some investment now to avoid these massively horrible things that are coming down the pike. And that has to be the calculus. And I know that's from a nerdy professor saying this and stuff, but doesn't own a business or whatever. But that's just the reality. And I think I would caution us about getting too focused on Southern California Edison. This is a society level thing that we need to deal with. And the childish dialogue that has surrounded some of these discussions is pathetic. And these are there's real challenges here, and we don't always have clear paths forward, but to not deal with them and embrace them and stick our head in the sand, that's the problem. And so if Southern California Edison is sticking their head in the sand, that's a problem. But I also think simply suing Southern California Edison, that's not going to get us there either. Again, it's a wider conversation, and we need to keep having these. And so you guys coming here is a great step in that. And so we appreciate you guys coming here and being involved.
Thanks, guys.
I was just about to ask you to clap again because our time is up, and I want to thank our panelists. And I think you know, but you might not know that these are all volunteers. They're basically doing this out of their own interest in the subject, and they spend time and energy, and it's really a wonderful thing. Thank you so much. And I hope you have the rest of a great weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.